know. Okay, sorry. So our lesson week 3 was about introduction to Vue. So we'll have a little bit of a review about that. Then we'll jump into the more Vue stuff, which is again kind of expanding upon the basics of Vue we learned last week and adding a few new things you'll need for your final project. Next week will be our last learning session. So we'll be doing NoSQL databases. And then we'll be having 2 project work days to work on the final project. Those are kind of optional, but I recommend you come to at least the first one so you can ask any questions you might have about the project, the due dates, the requirements, and any kind of technical stuff you might want to know more about. But, oh, that's the wrong slide. Here we go. If you need any help at any time, there are a lot of ways to get it. Obviously, you got this Saturday meeting, you got our recordings that come out usually every Sunday whenever I get a chance to publish them, and our review hours are Wednesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. I recommend you start coming to them now if you're a little bit confused, because everything you're going to learn will be needed for your final project. So clear it up now before it becomes an issue in 2 weeks. And finally, if you put a question in our Slack channels, one of us will get back to you like pretty much within an hour. So we're on it pretty much all the time. And so our teaching staff for the semester, there's me, Hadi, we got John over here, and Sam and Deshaun are in the other room with the intermediate students. And before we begin, as always, have your text editor open. If you don't have one, VS Code is a great option. This just is my preference. I mean, whatever works for you is the one that's meant for you. And our code, as always, is on GitHub. And in case a few people were confused about this last week, but to get on GitHub, you're going to be on the main branch by default, which is the master branch it's called. To get to the code for this week, go to the little drop-down menu here and choose the lesson number you want to use. So we're lesson 4, so you can click on the lesson 4 branch, and that'll take you to all of the demos and checkpoints for this week. All right. Part 1 is going to be a quick review. So what was Vue? Vue at the most core base, what it is a JavaScript library that modifies web pages for us. It stores values and variables, and then it actually those values and the variables can change how the page is formatted and rendered to the end user. Second is the idea of V directives, which are kind of like Vue directives that directly modify HTML to respond pretty much instantaneously to JavaScript changes, like variable changes or Boolean recalculations, whatever you might want to do. The easiest way to add Vue to a website is just to stick this in the head section of your HTML page. This is the Vue minimized Vue library. So you're going to just put this in, import all you need, and then your Vue will work perfectly out of the box with any code you add later. Now, the V directives were the most, I guess before we go back, does anyone want to tell me what the 4 V directives we learned were, if anyone can remember them? Online, please, by all means, please put them in the chat if you need. Yeah.
I don't have all of them, but I think it's
VF was one. Yep, you got it. Vion, yep.
I don't know.
That's fine. Anyone online have one give it a shot? We have VF and we got Vion. No? That's all right. We'll jump into it. There were 4. VBind was the first one I think you're missing. So VBind binds an HTML attribute to the value of a JavaScript variable. So for example, in this image tag here, if you remember, the src attribute tells the renderer, the browser, where to find the image you want to render or display to the user. If you do vbind source, then some data here, the attribute source will dynamically always match whatever the value of some data is. Meaning in this example here, you can change the source URL or source path for an image using JavaScript. You can, in theory, do this using HTML, like raw JavaScript and HTML as well, but it's much more annoying. And doing it this way, with letting Vue take care of it for you, makes your life a heck of a lot easier for like an Instagram clone, where you might have multiple images kind of going through the same couple tags. The next one is VF. That will kind of choose whether or not to render something to the screen. So you do VF equals, and then the name of a variable in quotes. And if that variable is true, that element will be displayed. If it is false, it'll be removed from the page. So in this case, if should see was true, the user would see some text is here. And if should see was false, you would see nothing. It actually be physically removed. The one cool thing about VIF versus some other kinds of libraries that do it is VIF actually removes it, not just hides it. Meaning, even if you inspect element over the actual code, you don't actually see it in the code even, because some other libraries do kind of hide it from the user, but still in the source code. Meaning, it's not really saving your browser any kind of work. The next two we talked about were vModel and vOn. So vModel was used to track text input to an input field, typically what you use it for, and save it into a variable. So for example, this input box here would be a text box on the screen, and as a user types some text into it, the value of the text in the box would always be the exact same as the value of message, meaning as a user changed their response to something, it would always, message would always kind of have the exact same changes synced to it. If you have, I kind of mentioned this last week too, it's very similar to a controlled input from other languages, if you're familiar with that, or in other libraries. And it's really useful for forms, because now you can always track what a user is typing as they type it in real time. And finally, vOn. This is probably the most important one for this week, so remember that in the back of your head. vOn responds to events. The most common event you're going to probably use vOn for is a click event for a button or a div or a link or whatever you might want to do. And to do it, you do vOn : and then the event name, which again in our case is most often click, and then the name of the method you want to run inside of Vue. So here's going to be method name, but honestly it can be whatever you want. There's some kind of event handler for that button. Are there any questions so far? All right, cool. Now here's an example of the Vue instance from last week. It's kind of a lot, but it's the comment should kind of explain what's going on a little bit to you guys. Remember, to define a new Vue instance, or actually the only Vue instance you should have in your website, you do then const, and then the app is a convention, it can be whatever you want to do, equals new Vue. And remember that the Vue parameters takes an object where there are several keys in the object that correspond to different parts of the Vue instance. For example, EL tells us where to mount Vue to. When we mount Vue, what that means is all of the tags within that element can be modified, seen, and manipulated by Vue. But any tags outside of that parent element are unable to be changed by Vue. Typically, in most sites, you're only ever going to have one div kind of control your entire site. And the div usually, this again, convention not required, has an ID of app. But again, that ID can be whatever you want. Now remember, that hash symbol means class, or ID. Theoretically, you could put like a class name in there, it would amount to every instance of that class, but I would not recommend that because it'll cause you multiple bugs and possibly errors in your code if you try to do that. Data is that we store all the data, JavaScript, we'll call them variables, but not really variables, for our Vue. So in this case, we have two, message and toggle. And message is a string, toggle is a boolean. And then finally, we have methods and computed. Methods is where you put all of the event handlers for your code from the vOn method name. Well, that goes here. In this case, our method name is setToggle, which is some function that just kind of alternates toggle between true and false. And we're going to make a wild guess and say that toggle is probably attached to a VF somewhere on HTML. Meaning, as we click the button, as it goes back and forth, we should be able to add and then remove some text from the page dynamically in real time. And then last but not least is computed. So computed is probably the trickiest one for people to kind of get their heads around. But essentially, computed is exactly like a function, but the function must return a single value, and the function can be treated like a variable inside of the HTML. This allows you to basically kind of have other data properties that depend upon data properties for their value. So for example, here, other toggle is a property that requires the normal toggle to determine what its value should be. And this is a very simple and probably a bad example of, you would never do this in the real world, but it's an example of how you can kind of chain multiple data values together to make a more complicated state value, for example. And again, other toggle will always be reevaluated every single time the value of toggle changes, meaning both toggle and other toggle will update in real time according to changes the code or the user makes to the program. Okay, is that been okay so far? A lot to review and kind of go over. If you aren't sure what we just covered, please look at last week's slides. It'll be very helpful. All right, now we're going to talk about the last V directive, which is probably the most important for your final project, and that is going to be V4. So V4 is basically a for loop, but for HTML elements. It allows you to create multiple HTML elements, one for each element, or one for each item in a JavaScript array. Oh, I have a chat here, sorry. What happened? That's fine. In a JavaScript array. So it'll actually dynamically change and resize how many elements are visible to the user based on how many elements are in the array. And this becomes very useful with custom components, which we'll talk about in about 10 slides from now. So the format for V4 is kind of like the format for the other V directives, but has very Python-like for loop syntax. So for example, if you have like a p tag, we want to use V4 for. We have the V4, again, tells it's a V directive, equals, and then in quotes, you give it some syntax. The syntax here is going to be for item in array, which again is very similar to Python's for loop syntax. Item will be some kind of item we store. An array is the name of the JavaScript variable or the JavaScript array we have in the data part of our Vue instance. And with this, we can now use item anywhere within this tag and kind of show things to the user, like display text or have like an object be passed around or whatever you want to do. And again, what's going to basically happen in this loop is for every item or every element in the array here, they'll make a new p tag, and all the p tag will do is display the text stored in that array. So this could be very useful for, say, your to-do list final, where you have to have multiple to-do items, and each item is going to be an element in an array most likely. And you can use something like this to dynamically create more to-do tasks or bullet points, depending upon how many items are in your list. So V4 really only works with a single element, meaning there should not be any nested or child elements inside of that element. Otherwise, it may not render correctly. So going back to our previous example of V4, we had just the p tag. If we had made the p tag a div tag, for example, and had something else inside of it, while it probably would work, it might cause you some bugs you don't expect. And so I recommend always just having a single element be V4'd over. If you need to really have multiple elements inside of your V4, use a custom component, which will be part 3 of lecture today. And finally, we need a key. So really, if you remember that very basic example, we just had the V4 and then the actual, the syntax for the V4. And if you remember again to week 3, like the very first slide, we talked about Vue, we mentioned how it's a computer algorithm and it can make changes a heck of a lot more better than humans can. For that reason, Vue needs a key. A key is some kind of unique identifier you give to each element in the V4. And what that allows Vue to do is determine whether or not when you change elements in the array or change elements on the page, does that element need to be re-rendered? So for example, if you have 4 elements and you remove, say, one of them, it only has to remove one and not the other 3, which saves your browser processing time, which can be very helpful if you say you have 100 elements in your array. It can be a pretty noticeable improvement. If you don't add keys to your items, every time the array changes, Vue will have to remove and then re-add every single item, which can get, again, really slow if you A, make a lot of changes to your array quickly, or B, have a very big array, which again is bad for the user, since if the user has a laggy time, they're not going to have a very good time on your website. So the key can be whatever you want. Vue does not care, as long as it is unique for each element in the V4, like an ID of some sort. So how do you add a key? Well, here's a proper V4 with the key syntax. So you can see the V4 and the item is the exact same, but now we've changed a few things here. So before, while item was just some, was assume or an array of text was array before, we have now made array a list of objects. Each object has two keys, a ID and a text key. Again, the ID can be whatever we want as long as it's guaranteed to be unique across all of the elements in the array. And again, text is going to be some text like it was before. So we say vbind key equals item.id. Note here, we use item because we define item as a temporary iteration variable in the V4 syntax. So you can do item.id and item.text in the actual text part of the field. Key isn't an actual HTML attribute by normally. However, Vue knows what it means. And when you do vbind to a key, it'll always make sure that it's updating the key internally and not showing that key to the user. Because again, key isn't really a real property. It's more of a fake one that we made up for Vue's use cases here. And for this reason, I highly recommend whenever you're using V4, you always make the elements in your array you V4 through an object. So you can store, both the ID and the actual value of your object at the exact same time. It makes your code a heck of a lot cleaner, and it'll make Vue much more efficient. With that in mind, let's jump over into demo program number 1. So let me open up my good old Notepad++ here. And we don't want to update just yet. Okay, and lesson 4, demo 1. So if you look at the HTML first, you'll see here that we have a pretty standard looking Vue page. We have our ID app, we have our random p tags kind of vibing around here, and then we have this UL and these LI elements. So again, UL is like a bullet point list, and LI, each bullet will be one separate LI tag. So if you look, this example is very similar to the code I gave on the PowerPoint, because really V4 is not that complicated. It's actually relatively simple to kind of put together. So we V4 item and list. Again, the item part is just whatever you want. I call it item because it makes sense in this context, but whatever you want to name it is a-okay. And again, list is going to be whatever you have in the JavaScript list. It doesn't have to be list. It can be, again, whatever you want, as long as it's a valid key in the data part of your Vue instance. And then the vbind key and the text formatting is the exact same as week 3 and from the slides. If we now open the JavaScript, we'll see we have a very, very simple Vue instance here. As always, we mount to the app in the app ID, and the data section of our Vue instance has one property, which is list, which is an array, to the brackets, of several objects. We have 3 objects within this array with IDs 0, 1, and 2. Remember, the IDs can be whatever they want. I choose to usually use numeric IDs because they're just easiest to keep track of unique. But again, it could be whatever you want. If you actually really wanted to, you could make the text the ID for all Vue cares. It'll work just fine. It'll just be annoying because you can't guarantee that the text will be unique across multiple elements. And then the text is some random string. So now if we actually open up our demo 1 program in our web browser, there we go. You'll see here that we have, I don't want to sync this, no thank you. We'll see we have the 3 bullet points properly populated with the 3 elements from the Vue instance. Got a question back there? No? All right, sounds good. Are there any questions about this demo program with using V4? Okay. With that in point, let's jump into checkpoint number 1. So your task for checkpoint number 1 is going to basically be your final project at a much smaller scale. You're going to make a page that has a text box and a button. When you click the button, the text from the text box will be added as a list item to the page. So basically, you're going to combine week 3's demo with or checkpoint with week 4's checkpoint. You're going to most likely need to use vbind, vmodel, v4, and yeah, basically almost all of the v directives. And as another kind of hint here, if you need to add something to an array in JavaScript, you would do dot push. So the array name dot push, and in the parentheses, you put the element you want to push to the end of the array. And again, that's all you have to do. Vue will take care of the rest. Cool. Well, in that case, we'll just we'll just move on then. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. We'll be more than happy to help you all out. So part 3 was Vue Components. So we spent the last, I guess, couple of slides talking about V4 and V directives, right? Which work off of manipulating raw Vue, or not raw HTML elements. Well, if you want to make something that's a bit fancier, using Vue Components, like have a repeat element in the V4, you can use V Components. So Vue can actually create and modify custom HTML components. These components will have their own data, their own methods, their own computer properties, their own event handlers, you name it, whatever. However, the one catch here is every component must be registered before you can use it in your code. So registering here just means that we tell Vue that our component exists, and that anytime it sees our custom HTML tag, it should replace that tag with some pre-made code that we define before our main Vue instance. So to register the component, you just, before the main, the whole new Vue part of our main Vue instance, you call Vue.Components. And then you pass it some parameters, and it will make a new element that will automatically be added whenever you see that tag appear in your HTML. So the rough outline for what this should look like is as follows. And we'll go through these fields one by one to make sure it's like fully clear what they all do. But most of this is going to be pretty familiar if you remember it all of the last time you did the Vue instance, last week or even this week. So first things first is the most important part of this component registration process is the component name. You're going to give it to in quotes after there's the first parameter, and then you must be a string. It must be lower, or not it must be, but convention is lowercase and kebab case. Kebab case is just every word is separated by a hyphen. The reason why you cannot use a capital letter or any kind of other symbols is because sometimes, and this is a very rare occurrence nowadays, but it's for backwards compatibility reasons, some browsers do not like it when their HTML tags have spaces or other non-alphanumeric characters, nor do they like it when there are a mix of both capital and lowercase letters inside of a tag element, a tag name. Like I said, I would say pretty much every modern browser since like 2015 probably just ignores that issue altogether. But in case you have to keep things backwards compatible, just always use kebab case for the component name. And this component name is also how you will represent the actual component in the HTML code. So it's basically the custom tag name you create and use in your HTML file. Props is probably the cooler one, the first new thing we'll talk about in components. They're going to be an array, and the array is going to be nothing but all the props or parameters basically that you want to pass from the main Vue instance to your Vue or to this component here. They're kind of passed like HTML properties or attributes, sorry, and they're completely optional. So you should only really have this if you absolutely need props. If you don't, no worries, don't bother including this at all. And we'll go through an example of how this should look in a much better example in the program. The second new part is the template string. So the template string is basically the string that describes the HTML tags of your element. So in essence, your Vue component is nothing more than a fancy tag that represents a bunch of other elements. For example, it could be a div tag, a couple of p tags, a text box, and image, all kind of combined. But you only reference, instead of those 5 tags, only one tag. For example, we'll call it component here. And every time Vue sees a component tag, it'll just replace it, copy and paste the template string into that file. So you can kind of, again, kind of simplify and encapsulate large amounts of data into a single tag. So this is going to contain all of your tags, your child tags, your redirectives, your classes, your IDs. Basically, again, it's a mini HTML page, just in a string format versus an actual HTML page. And finally, I guess the last change to kind of be careful of here is the data property. So if you recall, in the main Vue instance, data was a object, right? With every key representing a variable, we'll call it, that you want to modify and manipulate with JavaScript. However, with components, it's a bit of a trick here. The data field becomes from an object into a function that returns an object, which sounds really confusing. But basically, it'll return the object with the initial values for your data properties. In essence, it'll behave exactly like it would, normally speaking. However, the reason why you want to do it this way, and Vue enforces this for this reason, is because of the way Vue does components. Actually, technically speaking, when you do this Vue.component call, it registers every instance of this component with the same exact shared states, meaning all of the methods, the templates, the computed are shared across every instance to save memory and save processing time. What this means is all of the data fields are technically then combined. And you can imagine this could be a problem where if it was just kind of sharing one object, anytime you made a change from in one component's data field, that change would propagate to every other instance of that data property in those components. So for this reason, data should be a function that returns a set of initial values, and as such, every component maintains their own state. Therefore, you can have as many components as you want without any of this case interfering like they might if you didn't have this. Actually, if you don't include the function part here in the component, Vue will throw an error. And if you can't tell why it's not working, make sure your data is a function that returns an object. It's very confusing, but hopefully the demo should clear up a little bit in a couple slides. Finally, the last two are the exact same as they were in the regular Vue instance. So methods are just your normal methods and event handlers that we had last time. And computed is, again, the exact same. These, again, are all optional. You really only need this stuff. Actually, all of it except for the name is optional. You only need it if you basically need to use that kind of functionality. If you don't, just leave it out. Vue will not care. Does this make sense? All right. So let's look at demo number 2. All right, let's pop open. There we go. And I'm going to close out these 2 components. All right. Here's our very simple, very standard looking HTML page. We'll see here that we now have some new components. For example, basic component, prop component, and data component do not look like normal HTML tags because they're actually Vue components. So a few things to note here. Prop component has a prop called text, and data component also has a prop called text. And if you want to, again, pass props to your program, the way you do that is by basically passing it via an HTML attribute. So again, text isn't a real, another prop over here, isn't a real HTML attribute. It's like a fake one. But Vue will automatically know that it's meant to be a prop and give it to the element as a property. If you now look at the code, we'll come back to the HTML file in a second. We got a couple of components here. And here's a really quick tip that'll be very useful and very helpful for your coding is for the template string, don't use apostrophes, use something called a backtick or a grave mark. Reason for this is in JavaScript, the apostrophe, like the single quote, double quote, either one, double single quotes, are actually only a one-line string. Meaning, if you want to make like a template, like an HTML template, you have to condense the entire template down to a single line. meaning it's extremely difficult or impossible even to read, actually format the template properly. However, this little backtick, little grave mark, which is the key above the tab on a keyboard, is going to actually help you make a multi-line string, meaning JavaScript will just ignore all the new lines and allow you to have as many lines and as much stuff as you want in that string. And so for this reason, you're going to see all of our components use backticks because the template can be formatted the exact way we want to. And JavaScript will just strip out all the white space you don't want into make it a single line component or make it look nicer for us, but still usable for Vue. So for basic component, again, look at the kebab case, it's basic dash component, because again, backwards compatibility. A template string is really simple. It's just a basic div with a h3 and a pre-tag. Nothing too fancy going on there. Like I said, the only required part of the Vue Components registration process is the name of the template. Everything else is completely optional, and you should only use it if you actually need it. All right. Our next component is a prop component. And again, for backwards compatibility reasons, you should always make sure your props are lowercase, because again, sometimes browsers just don't support props the way you think they would. So here we have two props, text and another prop. And if you remember back, we pass those in like HTML attributes and use vbind to make sure that the actual value of that text is always what we want it to be. And again, it's an array of attributes here. So it's, one element text, one element, another prop. Template string is pretty simple, it's h3 and a couple of p tags. And in the p tag, you'll notice that we just call the props just like you would any other data property. This is because Vue actually will kind of condense this all down to a very nice structure. And as such, the properties, the props part of your tags or components become like normal data properties, meaning they can be used in functions or in text formatting or wherever else you might want to use a prop. So here we just got, we just stick them in the text so it'll display to the user. And then finally, we have a data component. So we have one prop text, which is just there for, whatever reason. And then the newer part here, we have a data part and a methods part. So again, data must be a function. Otherwise, Vue will give you an error and it will not run. And finally, this method is very simple. Basically, anytime you do Vue on click, you click this little button in the template string, it will increment the click counter, meaning you'll see how many times you've clicked the page right there on the web page. Do these three components make sense? All right. And then our Vue instance here is really simple. We just got our element and then three data properties, box, dog, and button. And if you go back to our HTML page, you'll notice that we bind text and another prop just like you would any other kind of vbind style of doing it. With that, let's jump into the actual demo. There we go. All right, so again, basic component, really simple. It shows up exactly how you would from a template string. The prop looks pretty similar. And if we were to change the value of the data fields in the Vue instance, it would change and sync those changes to the actual components on screen. And you can try that out in the browser console, actually. Then lastly, we have the data component. So if you look, we actually have, if I can get Zoom to hide itself, there we go. We have two data components, meaning if I click these, they are independent in state, meaning the count from the top there of the data component does not interfere with the data from the bottom data component. They're independent. And actually, if you take a look in our notepad and we try to say not how to be a function, like I have an example of it up here, let's copy that and replace the data with that, see what happens. And then we go back up and we refresh. You'll check your browser console. Yes, please. You'll see that it gives you an error and that this does nothing now because there's now an error because data is no longer a function, but rather an object because Vue is smart enough to avoid that happening altogether because you never want to do that actually. So we'll just remove that from Notepad. There we go. And we just refresh our page here, and there we go. And actually, like I said, if we do app dot, I believe it's fox, right? It is actually quick brown fox, right? There's the initial value. If we change it to something else like hungry, if it's spelled properly, hippo, that change is synchronized to the component almost immediately, because props are always a one-way direction, and again, Vue will always reevaluate every render decision in real time. Are there any questions about this demo program? Okay, what is going on here? There we go. Cool. Now we have two more things to cover before our last checkpoint for today. The first one is a component slot. And this is probably the most kind of weirder one to think about, but you might have a very good use case for it in both the final project and any kind of other web projects you want to make using Vue. So the component slot allows other HTML elements to be placed inside of the components. Well, what does that mean? If you remember back to the demo program, the HTML elements was they were blank, right? They were the opening tag and then the closing tag and nothing in between. Well, a slot allows you to actually place stuff in between those elements like you would like a p tag or a div tag or whatever else you want to use. And as such, the component can act like a wrapper around some other HTML elements. And to do this, you would use the slot tag, which again, isn't actually HTML. It's just something that Vue creates and provides for you. And finally, again, we'll call this program number 3. The last thing to cover today is custom events. You will most definitely be using this for your final projects. I recommend, if you have to remember anything from today, it's probably going to be this. Components, if you want to communicate data to the component, we can use props. But if you want to communicate data from the component to the Vue instance, it's a bit trickier, right? For that, you have to use custom events. Well, if you remember events, right? Like the click event we covered in Vue, that was defined by the browser. Using custom events, though, we can make any events that we want and have Vue handle it like we would any other normal event. To do it inside of your component, you type this $emit. The $, if you ever see this in Vue, the $, always indicates that this is a function or a variable that's global to the actual Vue runtime library. Because emit is so useful, it's a global runtime function. And then you have, so in the emit function, there are multiple, it's one required parameter and several optional parameters. The first required one is name, where you provide the name for your custom event you want to raise. And then the ... you see here, optional parameters, and that is any optional data you want to pass to the event handler. What that means is you can actually send data up the chain, right, to the event handler, even if you maybe couldn't do it normally with the components. And again, this part is optional. You only have to include that if you actually need data in the event handler. And with custom events, you can use Vue like you do normally. Just change the word click in the Vue to the name you put in the function, in the emit for the this.emit. All right, so for the demo program number 3, which should be much clearer, I think, when we go through it there. Here we go. I'll close these two up. So here's our 3 demo project, components here. We have this demo component. As you can see, it's a pretty standard looking component. But note this in the middle here on line 7 is this slot tag. This slot tag, again, remember back to our slot component, means that Vue will replace the slot with any element we nest inside of it in the HTML file, meaning that demo component is actually a wrapper for some other component, other kind of HTML elements. We also have a second element where we have a child component, which has 2 buttons, a send press and a send other, which we triggered by these 2 event handlers. And again, we can still use Vue click because they're buttons. But think about this. If you look at the HTML file here, we have two buttons inside of child components. But because each component is separate from the Vue instance, the main Vue instance can't really tell which button was pressed because they're both just buttons to it, really, both clicks. For that reason, we can use custom events to tell Vue, the main Vue instance, which button was clicked. Because Vue can't kind of peek in. You can just see what the global top level view of child components is. And so inside of this, this component, we have two methods, send press and send other, and both of them will send an event. One will send press, and one will send other. And again, these are custom events that can be whatever you want to name them. Click is, I would avoid click though, or any kind of reserved keyword, because those can cause bugs that you don't expect in your program. Now, if you look here, we have a Vion. Instead of click, we have press and other, meaning we can actually handle these separately in the program. And if you go back to the Vue file here, we have a methods. Whenever we press the press button, it'll increment the click count. And whenever we press other, it'll print on the console, pressed other. So we'll look at the demo code in the browser now, which is probably the useful. And let's open up our browser console. Now, if we press, you'll see it increments the counter like we expected, right? So many times we do. And this button will always print press other. As you can see, the number means it's the same kind of line repeated over and over and over. And so with this example, we're now sending multiple custom events to kind of like translate our button presses from our component to our main Vue instance. Why you want to do this is very simple. Well, if you say you have in your final project a to-do list or to-do task, right, with an edit button and a maybe delete button, the main Vue instance can't tell whether you pressed edit or delete. And so you can raise custom events that can tell Vue whether to, edit this to-do list or delete this item from the array. Because again, you can only send data in one way using props. You can't just, remove the props. It's not valid Vue. So does this demo make sense? Does it kind of see how slots and events kind of work together? Yes, no, maybe so? Yeah, what's up? Yeah, of course. Yep, I will for sure. So custom events, like I said, are kind of like ways that you can use, or a way to use. So you could kind of have multiple buttons within a single component, and then tell Vue, the main Vue instance, which button was pressed. Because again, because of the way Vue works for both resource and security, Vue cannot peek inside custom components. It only knows what the main kind of top level bindings for it are. So in this example, this code here, the main Vue instance only knows this. It has no idea how child component works. All it knows is that child component can raise a press event and other events. And it's up to the actual component in this case to determine when those events should be triggered and like what they should be doing both internally and externally. Does that make it any clearer? Is that it's more confusing? Okay, so as an example here, we have two buttons.
Yeah, and the two buttons, and the first one event is Vue.
Which button was pressed? Yes, you got it. And these two event handlers are, again, both using Vue on click because we can see the button, but the main Vue instance can't. And while they just emit an event, you don't have to do that. You can like do something else internally before emitting the event for all you want to do. So for example, on your final project, what you could do, right, is you could have some kind of like an edit button, right? And your edit button will, modify the text in the element before emitting it to the main Vue instance. So you would change your internal state before telling the Vue instance, before telling Vue that you changed your internal state or something like that sort. Does that make it clear? Or that kind of more confusing? All right, cool. Are there any other questions about components or slots? All right. In that case, we will hop back here. That puts us at our checkpoint, which we'll come back to in a second. First of all, thank you all for coming. Please fill out our feedback form. We would appreciate any feedback you have for our lesson today. And if you do want some more help with the components slots of V4, please come to our review hours on Wednesday at 6 to 7. And we'll also be going over the project next week, so please make sure you come back next week. All right, so checkpoint number 2 is to basically modify checkpoint number 1 to basically use components, slots, and events. It's not too complicated, hopefully, and this will basically serve as the framework for your final project, since the requirements will be to use, I think, 2 components, 1 slot, and 2 custom events, at least. So think about how you can kind of begin to integrate that into your code base, that your final project is pretty straightforward for later. All right, I want to stop the recording.